Hello everyone, my name is Ashley Jeffords and this is my presentation of my capstone project. My capstone is entitled Art History in Response to the Global Age, an exploration of the treatment of world collections by museums and academia. And though my title may be long-winded, I assure you that the goal of the project is very succinct. It is to assess how, in the year 2022, in the most globalized world we've had so far, is art history being ethically considered and presented, especially those works that are included in what we would call world collections. In my research, I wanted to explore the treatments of the collections from the beginning of the post-colonial, post-imperial era to contemporary times to see if things have gotten better, gotten worse, or even changed at all from the outset. In looking at various world collections throughout time and in varying locations, I identified that there were four main concerns at hand when addressing each instance. The first one would be the influence of globalization on a specific location, particularly in specific the geopolitical climate of a region housing the collection. The geopolitical climate would determine if the country is open to repatriation, or if there's any divisive societal issues that are occurring that may make the country hostile to deal with when addressing those issues. The second matter of concern would be post-colonial societal activism and whether or not it is occurring in that location. If it's not, why is it not occurring there? Is there a lack of accessibility? Are people aware of the issues for where it is occurring? Why are some collections more contentious than others? And why are some locations more popular to see activism happening? The third concern is resistance to change on an institutional level. Going through the process of your collection and ensuring provenance and things like that can reveal sometimes the faults of the institution, and having to admit those faults can be really hard for an institution, especially one that has garnered a lot of esteem throughout the years. There's the potential to have to apologize or expose errors in the historical narrative that they have presented to the public, and so that's always a concern, especially on the financial end of institutions. And then finally, the ability to implement the identified changes. If they have been implemented, are they progressive or minimal? What has the effort been in re-educating the public on the falsehoods that were perpetrated by the presentation before, or even that things have changed in the museum themselves? These issues may feel niche and cultural specific, which they are, but the responses to these issues are a good metric of how society believes cultural art objects should be treated. You can put yourself in the shoes of someone from that culture, and it's really easy to see that it no longer feels really insignificant when something like that is missing. Speaking in an AHR conversation in 2009 on the presentation of material culture in the global age, Chris Whitmore said the following: "With respect to the distinction between language and things, there are numerous underlying and pesky bifurcations, old as Plato himself, which hamper our ability to come to terms with these issues. This bifurcation plays out in rendering things as carriers of meaning, as means to a specific end, as vehicles for language. All these translations are different in small, often subtle ways, and they impact the outcomes of our engagements with them." I think this quote is so important because the bifurcation of language and things that Whitmore identifies is reminiscent of the power that is held within the choice to properly teach about objects of cultural value and the choice to make said works as accessible to as many audiences as possible. One of the biggest issues that kept popping up throughout the entirety of my research were the issues with the historical narrative as it stands, and the fact that this historical narrative is comprised of many pick-and-choose stories that try to covertly sweep the ugly parts of history under the rug. In America, we recognize for the most part that whitewashing of American history has been the status quo for a long time, thinking back to how we are taught about the Pilgrims and their first forays into the Americas, how the Civil War and Reconstruction eras have been romanticized, how we gloss over our military actions in bringing democracy to the world, and how we relegate certain cultures, which means certain arts, as primitive with no real metric to determine that. One of the earliest and most powerful examples of restoring truth to a whitewashed narrative would be Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum exhibition in 1992. In this exhibition, Wilson, a Black American artist, took control over the entirety of the Maryland Historical Society's gallery space and their collection, both what was on display and what they had chosen not to show. Working to dispel myths of an overly romantic Reconstruction period, Wilson situated cultural objects in the gallery in a way that exposed the huge disparity between the history that had been retold and historical fact. What you see here is one of the said installations. This work was entitled Cabinet Making, 1820 to 1960 by Wilson. Here he takes Victorian-era chairs, the most fine from their time period, and arranged them facing a whipping post from the same time era that was used in the systemic abuse of enslaved peoples. When mining the collection, Wilson actually found all these objects stored away together. This arrangement was meant to purposely unsettle viewers, a stark visual reminder that refined people would once collect in public squares to enjoy lynchings as a community. We see the ideals instilled by Wilson through Mining the Museum applied in contemporary works of activism art. His act of mining is much more than just that. It's truth-telling, history-making, settling a precedent of rejecting falsities, and reclaiming the past white Americans may be ashamed of. In 2019, with his sculptures Rumors of War, Kinde Wiley reclaims once again the Confederate War Memorial for the Black man, refusing to accept that it is normal to put Confederate soldiers on a pedestal when they were literally fighting to categorize some people as subhuman. Shows how Fred Wilson's work remains very contemporary. I next speak about confronting the monolith that is the institution known as the British Museum, which, truth be told, is an entire project unto itself, as this is arguably the most controversial world collection, as it is almost entirely the result of imperialistic looting on behalf of the British Empire. Notoriously tight-lipped and resistant to public pressures, the British Museum is home to some of the most precious cultural objects in the world: the Parthenon marbles, the Rosetta Stone, and the Benin bronzes, just to name a few. There's a lot of activism surrounding cultural repatriation. Some watch groups with specific aims focus on the British Museum. In my capstone, I discuss at length the issues surrounding the provenance and repatriation of the Parthenon marbles to Athens, Greece. I speak about the staunch refusals of the British Museum to return it thus far, though there have been official requests by the Greek government. I speak about how, for a long time, their excuse was that there was nowhere in Greece to properly store and care for the marbles, but in 2009, the Acropolis Museum was opened, And if you haven't been, it's one of the most beautiful museums in the world, and they have spaces reserved for the marbles that would just be amazing if they could go back home. And I speak about how in current news, there is a government body being formed to consider the return, and the majority of the British public, when polled, would want to return the marbles to Athens. And in this, we can see the aims of current activism would be to speak about accountability, ensuring that provenance is ethical and accurate, addressing and considering fairly all requests for repatriation, funding and implementation strategies, allocating funds and employees to comb through collections and remake didactic materials, and showing that it is feasible. How can a museum and institution feasibly roll out new programming? What are examples of how this has been handled before and its successes and failures? And all of this is to come together of a goal of ethical collection management. I also speak on the Rosetta Stone. This is a picture I took of it on my own trip to the British Museum in 2018. And a recent call from 2,500 archaeologists for its repatriation to Egypt. The petition for repatriation touches on how culturally sensitive and triggering these issues are. In the petition, it is written that the confiscation of the Rosetta Stone, among other artifacts, is an act of encroachment on Egyptian cultural property and identity, and is a direct result of cultural colonial violence against Egyptian cultural heritage. The presence of these artifacts in the British Museum to this day supports past colonial endeavors of cultural violence. History cannot be changed, but it can be corrected. And although the political, military, and governmental rule of the British Empire withdrew from Egypt years ago, cultural colonization is not yet over. I next look to the institution formerly known as the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and how it confronted its issues with colonization in preparation for the 150th anniversary of the founding of Canada. In this case, the government itself actually ordered that the museum change its name and mission to better reflect the history of all of Canada, not just the past centuries of European colonization and cultural takeover. The museum is now called the Canadian Museum of History, and celebrates the native cultural groups for their significance to Canada to this day. Here is an image of the Great Entrance Hall, and you can see that these are cultural objects from indigenous groups that are actually native to Canada. A museum board member, James D. Fleck, spoke on the issue that clearly a balance will have to be struck between the telling of the Canadian history that people take pride in and revealing lesser-known parts of our history that may also be less easy to consume comfortably. Simply, we must build an informed citizenry that is also sensitive to the mistakes made in the past. There has to be an active choice made by larger institutions to repatriate art to enrich the communities they come from, while maintaining an active desire to right all contextual wrongs of previous presentations. The burdens of the past are sadly the problems of the present, but the future is looking bright for a world where art can be enjoyed, free of false narratives, accessibility barriers, a history of looting, and improper primitive contextualizations. The research shows that there are ethical solutions to recontextualize art in our ever-globalizing world. The narrative can be repaired with permission of the oppressors or without. Their power is no longer all-consuming, but ours to change history is.